In the summer of 1480, a fleet of nearly 150 Ottoman ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of southern Italy. Aboard these vessels were approximately 18,000 soldiers under the command of Gedik Ahmed Pasha, one of Sultan Mehmed II's most experienced military commanders. Their destination was Otranto, a small port city on the heel of the Italian peninsula, separated from Ottoman-controlled Albania by just 50 miles of Adriatic Sea. This was not a random target. Otranto represented the closest point between the Ottoman Empire and the Italian heartland. For Sultan Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople in 1453 and expanded Ottoman territory across the Balkans, Italy was the next logical objective in his vision of restoring a Mediterranean empire. The city of Otranto had approximately 6,000 inhabitants and a garrison of perhaps 400 soldiers. The medieval walls had been built centuries earlier for a different kind of warfare, against Ottoman siege artillery and engineering techniques that had already broken the defenses of Constantinople. These fortifications were inadequate. When the Ottoman fleet arrived on July 28, 1480, the people of Otranto faced an impossible choice. The nearest significant military force capable of relieving them was in Naples, days away even if King Ferdinand moved immediately. The garrison commander, Francesco Zerlo, understood the mathematics of the situation but chose to defend the city anyway. The siege began with bombardment. Ottoman cannons pounded the walls while messengers delivered terms to the defenders. Contemporary sources record that Gedik Ahmed Pasha offered standard Ottoman conditions: surrender, convert to Islam, accept Ottoman rule, and the population would be spared. Resistance would result in the full consequences prescribed by Islamic military law for cities that refused terms. The city refused. For 15 days, the garrison and armed civilians fought to hold the walls while Ottoman engineers worked to breach them. Archbishop Stefano Agricolai led prayers for the defenders. The clergy prepared the population for what might come. On August 11th, the walls were breached in multiple locations. Ottoman soldiers entered the city and the systematic conquest began. What followed is documented in multiple contemporary sources: Neapolitan chronicles, papal correspondence, Ottoman military records, and survivor testimony gathered in subsequent months. The male population of military age was separated from the rest. On August 12th, approximately 800 men were taken to a hill outside the city known as the Minerva. There, according to multiple independent accounts, they were offered a final opportunity to convert to Islam. The sources agree on what happened next. The men refused, and they were executed. Archbishop Stefano Agricolai was killed in a manner described in the sources as particularly brutal, likely intended to break the resolve of the remaining prisoners. It did not. The executions continued throughout the day. These 800 men would become known as the Martyrs of Otranto. Their refusal to renounce Christianity under threat of death was documented by church authorities and eventually became part of Catholic tradition. In 2013, Pope Francis canonized them as saints, recognizing their deaths as martyrdom for the faith. But the 800 men were not the only inhabitants of Otranto. The answer is found in documents that have received far less attention than the story of the martyrs. Ottoman military practice in the 15th century distinguished between categories of captives. Men of military age who refused conversion were typically executed, as happened at Otranto, but women, children, and the elderly who survived the initial conquest became captives, subject to enslavement under the laws of war as practiced by Ottoman forces. Multiple sources document that thousands of captives were taken from Otranto following the conquest. Neapolitan records mention appeals to ransom captives. Papal correspondence refers to Italians held in Ottoman territories. Venetian diplomatic dispatches report Italian slaves appearing in markets across the eastern Mediterranean in the months following Otranto's fall. Among these captives were the nuns from Otranto's convents. The city had several religious houses, including Santa Maria del Carmine. These women had taken vows of consecration, dedicating their lives to prayer and religious service. Their fate would become part of the historical record through testimony that would eventually reach Pope Sixtus IV. The transportation of captives from conquered cities was a standard practice in 15th century Ottoman military operations. Captives represented economic value and could be sold in slave markets, ransomed back to their families, or distributed among soldiers as rewards for service. The markets of Albania, directly across the Adriatic from Otranto, were known centers for the slave trade. Contemporary sources document that ships departed Otranto carrying thousands of captives, predominantly women and children. Since most men of military age had been executed, the journey across the Adriatic would have taken between 12 and 24 hours depending on weather conditions. What happened during this transport and in the weeks that followed is documented in testimony collected by church authorities. Some of this testimony comes from captives who were eventually ransomed or escaped and made their way back to Italian territory. These accounts were compiled by papal investigators seeking to understand the full extent of what had occurred at Otranto. One particularly detailed account comes from a document preserved in Vatican archives attributed to a nun named Lucia Ferranti of Santa Maria del Carmine. Her testimony, given after she was eventually ransomed, describes the conquest of the city, the killing of the archbishop and the male prisoners, and the experience of captivity. Her account and others like it provided Pope Sixtus IV with information that would shape his response. The Pope issued multiple bulls calling for a crusade to retake Otranto and drive Ottoman forces from Italian territory. These documents make clear that the treatment of the captives, particularly the treatment of consecrated religious women, was central to the papal justification for holy war. The fate of nuns captured in warfare was a particularly sensitive issue for the medieval church. Canon law held that consecrated virgins were brides of Christ, and their violation was considered not just a crime against individuals but a sacrilege against the church itself. The testimony from Otranto survivors described treatment that church authorities classified as martyrdom of a different kind than that suffered by the 800 men. But while the male martyrs would be celebrated, memorialized, and eventually canonized, the church's treatment of female survivors was more complicated. Medieval attitudes toward sexual violence reflected broader assumptions about honor and shame. Women who survived such experiences often faced stigma, even when church authorities acknowledged they were victims. This may explain why the story of the women of Otranto has been less prominent in historical memory than the story of the 800 male martyrs. The men's choice to die rather than convert fit clearly into categories the church celebrated. The women's survival through circumstances beyond their control presented complications that medieval theology struggled to address. Modern historians working with the available sources face challenges in reconstructing exactly what happened. Ottoman military records from this period are incomplete. Italian sources from the immediate aftermath are colored by the trauma of the event and by propagandistic intentions to mobilize support for a crusade. Survivor testimony, while valuable, reflects the limitations of what individuals could observe and the frameworks they used to interpret their experiences. What we can say with certainty is this: Otranto fell to Ottoman forces in August 1480. Approximately 800 men were executed for refusing to convert to Islam. Thousands of other inhabitants, predominantly women and children, were taken captive. Many of these captives were transported to Ottoman territories where they entered the slave trade. Some were eventually ransomed. Many were never heard from again. The Ottoman occupation of Otranto lasted 13 months. In September 1481, a combined force from Naples and other Italian states, supported by papal finances and preaching of crusade, besieged the city. The Ottoman garrison, weakened by disease and facing supply difficulties after the death of Sultan Mehmed II, disrupted command structures, eventually withdrew. The city was retaken, but it was no longer the community it had been. The population had been decimated. The trauma of the conquest and occupation would shape the region's memory for centuries. The martyrs of Otranto became symbols of Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. Their story was told in churches, commemorated in art, and preserved in liturgical tradition. The canonization in 2013 brought renewed attention to their sacrifice, but the complete story of Otranto includes everyone who lived through those days in August 1480, the men who chose death over conversion, the women and children who did not have that choice, the families torn apart, the community destroyed. Understanding this history requires holding both truths. We can recognize the courage of those who chose martyrdom while also acknowledging the suffering of those whose fate was survival under circumstances no one should endure. This is the legacy of Otranto 1480, a city caught between empires, a population that faced impossible choices, and a story that the sources allow us to reconstruct only incompletely, but that deserves to be remembered in its full complexity.